My name is Matthias Sauerbruch. I'm currently the director of the architecture section at the Academy of Arts in Berlin. And I'm very, very happy and honored to welcome Kjetil Thorsen from Oslo today for one of our talks and conversations that we entitled On the Power and Duty of Architecture. It's been a kind of series that's been going on for some years now. And the idea is very much that of the Academy, i.e. members of the Academy talking to each other about what they're involved in, what they're working on, what their views of the profession are, etc. Kjetil has been a member of the Academy for more than 10 years now. And he's been actually very active, kind of coming to Berlin every now and then, and very much taking part at the life of the discussion and discourse of our group. And now, as we are kind of in the pandemic and we obviously cannot meet, the last events were actually with Daniel Liebeskind, I think, and Anne Lacaton. These were live events, obviously, and a kind of a larger group of people come together. But given the pandemic and the lockdown and so on, we cannot do that. And I'm very happy that instead we are now talking to each other via video conference. Kjetil, thank you very much for taking the time. For those who are not familiar with the contemporary architecture scene, let me just say that Kjetil Thorsen is one of the key leaders of one of the, I'd say, most important offices in Europe, certainly, maybe the world, called Snøhetta. And he has, funnily enough, I only found out today that you went to school actually in Germany, in Essen, for 3 years, but then he also studied in Austria, in Graz, his architecture degree. And so hence, and there's also an office now in Austria, and hence he actually fluently speaks German. But we decided to conduct this conversation in English, as the audience of Snøhetta obviously is less likely to speak German, and hence we're probably reaching more a larger audience this way. Kjetil has started his career in a small office, more or less by himself in 1985, and founded together with some partners in 1987 this company, which is named after the second, as I understand, second tallest mountain in Norway, called Snøhetta. And I also was informed that the tallest one has such a complicated name that it would have been totally unacceptable on the international scene. So I'm glad you decided for Snøhetta. And Snøhetta has currently more than 200 employees, and they're working in various locations in the world. Oslo is the starting point, but there are offices in New York and San Francisco, in Paris currently, Hong Kong, Adelaide, and Innsbruck, which I find interesting, sort of like from mountain to mountain. It seems like there's a certain current, a certain joint spirit that ties you two together. It's a kind of unusual office in that it's very integrated in its approach. I mean, there are urbanists, landscape art, architects, planners, but also designers, artists working together in one huge sort of group, if you like. And the scope of your work is very impressive. When one looks at the website, it kind of starts off with small objects like glass or furniture or crockery or things like that, and ends up in huge conference centers or libraries, etc., all over the world. You're also unusual in that you've decided to go for a kind of democratic, if I may call that, office structure, even though you're one of the original founders of the group. I understand that you're a primus inter pares, a kind of one leader amongst many, and most of your strategic business and maybe also sometimes architectural decisions are being taken in dialogue which I personally find very interesting. Maybe we'll talk about that later a little bit. But anyway, the kind of the ritual of our meetings is that the guest has the opportunity to articulate him or herself with a few ideas or maybe works or whatever, and then we start a conversation. So, Kjetil, if you're ready, I would very much like to invite you to introduce your work. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Matthias, for the invitation, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. As always, I like to show works because that exemplifies where we're coming from and the point of view, and especially on a day like today here in Oslo with minus 12 degrees, you know, you have to shiver off the cold and dive into the projects in partially warmer regions. So let me start the presentation as such. I love the theme, power and duty. Of course, when we talk about that in architecture, these two words are correlated, and they have, in many ways, a very, very specific meaning, I think, also in politics. But let us just move forward and look at the background from where we started and how we grew up as architects from the 70s. In the 70s. And, you know, the Erklärung von Bern was a very, very important statement for us as students already, where the environmental issues started popping up in different, under different circumstances and in different constellations. But let me just say that these kind of things influenced us immensely already while we were studying, and the topic of today is, of course, touching upon these things very, very specifically, because part of power and duty is, of course, when it comes to the understanding of sustainability. In 1987, the Brundtland Commission established the first direction of our common future in a huge, large document. And this was when social, environmental, and economical sustainability became part of the UN way of looking at our future. For the first time, we had something that until today has led us up to the sustainability goals of the UN today. But these were defined in 87, and by coincidence, we were established the same year. As such, with, of course, growing up with our Prime Minister, Gro Harlem Brundtland, trying to focus on these things continuously during that period of time. So, from there on, since 1987, as Matthias already mentioned, we have all kinds of different locations, not necessarily only major cities, although New York and Paris might be considered major cities, but Innsbruck hardly is, Hong Kong is, Adelaide hardly is a major city. So the locations that we've chosen are more out of convenience, you could say, also related to how we work and what kind of power we can influence these particular surroundings with. We meet every second year up in the mountain of Snøhetta, and we gather in one of our projects there, and we have a 2-day common description of how the next year or next 2 years are going to look like in the combination of discussions. We call this the Dovre conversations, and Dovre is the mountain area where Snøhetta is the highest peak. Of course, we also know very strongly that affect behavior and cognition is directly related to architecture and urban design. And I think we'll start looking at what kind of situations are happening around the world when we have the polarization that we're seeing. Can we at all, as architects, as designers, help to mitigate certain situations out there with the effect that that might have on the way we actually experience our surroundings? The first project, and I'll mention just some very few, one was, of course, the competition for the new library in Alexandria, where sort of the social aspects of our work were really kind of the most important part. We educated young masons over a period of 2 years to carve in big letters in stone. We re-educated them, and we included workers and workers' payments on a monthly basis. We gave them hard hats and hard shoes and water and extra one to survive in the heat during the day. And we were awarded by the protection of the people during the Arabic Spring, when the population of Alexandria actually protected the building 24 hours a day. We continue this kind of approach of accessibility and social sustainability with the Opera House in Oslo. And as you know, that expanded into a public ownership situation where the claim is, if you can touch it, you can own it. If you can sit on it, you can own it. And these type of things started developing as part of our, let's say, backbone understanding of what architecture might be when it comes to objects. Just to show you a little example of that. So that demands even the randomness of creating accessibility in a different way also opens up for illegal use to some extent. It opens up for the possibilities of how these things come together and how they're being used by others. Furthermore, our Times Square project was also showing that accessibility to a place gives you different notions of use and also, of course, location of your eye and experiences differently in the city. I'm going to go into a very difficult project in many ways, also for us, and the way we actually experience the notion of creating architectures in difficult regimes and political regimes. This particular project that I'm going to go through more in detail is called the King Abdulaziz Center for World Culture. Now, we're quite aware of the discussion and the political discussion ongoing worldwide for the moment. But we have to take this kind of position of ourselves as architects in our surrounding world serious when it comes to exactly the power and duty of architecture. Can we at all, through architecture, influence anything at all? The concept of the King Abdulaziz Center for World Culture started with referring to Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, where Kublai Khan and Marco Polo are discussing the Roman arch, and where the description of this arch with the keystone is defining certain aspects of society. The keystone is our culture, and it's holding up the Roman arch as it's leading its way down to the ground and transmitting the forces back into the ground. We were actually using this keystone element in trying to establish a sketch and an understanding of a building, which then became a series of dependencies, or rather objects that were holding each other up from a structural point of view. Now you can see in the section here that the smallest stone is the most important stone. That is the stone that holds everything up. And it was meant also as a comment to our client, Saudi Aramco, that don't neglect the smallest parts of society simply because they might be the most important elements of what you're dealing with. So then we developed a project with the keystone in the middle, with a tower and certain other functions surrounding a central element. There was also a big development of a garden, something that we then called the monosurface. And the monosurface was growing with very, very site-specific and very much direct plantings from the surroundings from Saudi Arabia. So this is just to give you an overview of the site plan, how it actually looked at that point in time. Now, this kind of Fata Morgana situation of this building was an intentional way of trying to move away from a certain perception of what culture could mean in a country like Saudi Arabia. You have to remember that this country, with its development only 50 years old, has never gone through modernism. And as such, they have also no concept of postmodernism when it comes to the discussion of form, shape, or function. So we were rather looking at the interdependencies that certain elements were exposing themselves to. So the plan became a very simple plan, maybe, with a very central core, or plaza. And this plaza is the place of distribution into all the different functions. To the upper right, you have a big exhibition hall. You have the two main entrances in red, to left, and to the right. You have an entrance into a cinema. You have an entrance into a library, an exhibition hall, and a lifelong learning center in a tower. And you have an entrance into a performing hall for theaters and such like. The section of the building shows that parts of the building is located under an artificial carpet, which is on the ground, and becoming also the way where these pebbles, if you like, are located in their surroundings. Now, the final expression of the building can be debated, but there is nothing in the surrounding that would not go back and claim that this is a center for culture. And the discussion around how expressive can you be with a building, complex as it is, in a surrounding like this, and still maintain integrity for how you expose the activities to come. Now, as I mentioned, complexity is just the beginning of the sentence. It was immensely difficult to build, and it took us more than 10 years to finalize this building, with a high complexity of structure, cantilevers, the shape of the tower, all the joints and how these things were coming together, also from a coordination point of view. But for the expressional element in the functions, creating the first public cinema for men and women in Saudi Arabia, creating the first common entrance for men and women to a cultural building, not a private house, in Saudi Arabia, we had to choose our materials that then were exposing this cultural building in a manner that also became relevant for the users that were coming in at the same time. We wanted, to put it bluntly, have men and women kissing in the library. So we decided for two major materials. One was the thread, or the line, to cover the surfaces of these pebbles or these buildings. And we started by making continuous lines, starting as a geometry from the openings into the different functions. And through this geometry, actually shaping also fingerprints for each and every part of the pebbles. We used high technology to bend these pipes with a 3mm precision. And all of a sudden, we had a facade which could be squeezed flat for the window openings, and then the pipes were continuing wrapping around the pebbles. Sele were, of course, extremely involved in the further development of this, and the procedures of trying to mount 300 kilometers of pipes, stainless steel pipes, became an immense way of working. At the same time, we were testing out these pipes to carry some water for cooling. We were also testing out the wind draft and the spread of island warming or heating by the reflection of the shapes and the way the building happened to be. So this is the keystone as it sits in the building today. You can see the joints of the pipes coming together based on the geometry. You can see the keystone cantilevering out into the different elements of the building from perspective, and how the pipes are coming together in the different joints that we're dealing with. The second material that we had to choose was much older than the stainless steel pipes, which sort of come out of a modern perception of how things are to be dealt with. And we chose rammed earth. And of course, we had been using rammed earth in smaller scales at this point in time, but we'd never established a full-scale mass production of rammed earth elements. And the team that actually worked on these rammed earth elements, and which we educated basically for the rammed earth production here in Saudi Arabia, also then later moved to Bangladesh to produce other buildings. So the rammed earth elements put together in large scale here were the first way of trying to touch upon this base of 3,500 years of building history connected into one detail. The use of materials with rammed earth meeting the stainless steel pipes became a big issue for us, simply because it showed that there is a prehistoric element also deeply embedded in Saudi Arabia. And I have to say, the first exhibition of pre-Islamic history in Saudi Arabia was then finally shown in this building. The big plaza distributes, like I said, into the different elements, and it's a gathering point for all kinds of people. Another one is up into the library, and how men, women, families are meeting in these places is today beautiful to see, because also finally the collection of books is going up, and also the discussions we're having on what type of books to have is becoming a big issue. So we have an ongoing debate on these issues. There are smaller seating places. The geometry is depending on how you perceive the building. You can also enter into the tower, the top tower, with the views out. So this is the top of the tower. And you can move down through a ramp into the museum parts of the building, through these big twisted glue lamp columns that actually open up to a courtyard on the outside. Or in the Keystone itself, which is a continuous learning environment where people are meeting, and all these things are interconnected in this way. From the main entrance, how it looks with the very soft but still kind of local landscaping, the cacti, how they operate. But this picture is maybe more to the point, this picture and the next. Through a series of years, Saudi Aramco have had what they call the summer school for culture, writing, filmmaking, establishing the changes that might come through the piece of architectures and the connected program of these architectures in the future. For instance, I'm not sure if you've heard of The Green Bicycle, but The Green Bicycle was a very famous film a couple of years ago by Haifa al-Mansour, and she was educated during these summer schools in Saudi. So a next generation of people have been educated in literature, in film, in theater, in singing, in writing, in architecture, in art, through this center which is now operating. And we also see it as part of our commission to continue working with these people, for instance, here in the Great Hall, where we actually established, together with Saudi Aramco, the first Edvard Munch exhibition. Now you have to remember that showing faces and pictures of people in this situation is a breakthrough. You have to understand that by introducing certain aspects of art into societies who have not had accessibility to this type of art is a way of empowering the people who are coming there. So this exhibition was designed by us. We had more than 60 paintings of Edvard Munch shown in Saudi Arabia in an Arabic-speaking world as such for the first time. And we designed this exhibition for us to be able to get to the soul of things. So we could actually confront the public with certain elements that would on one hand be Nordic, on the other hand very clearly related to the artworks of Edvard Munch. Now, the exhibition was called Landscapes of the Soul. And the entrance into some of these little units that you saw where the exhibition is had specific names that were dealing with topics, not necessarily normal topics in the public realm of Saudi Arabia. One was, for instance, loneliness as such, as a theme related to Edvard Munch's work. Another one was love, related to Edvard Munch's work. And the experience of these pictures inside these cubicles then all of a sudden gave us the possibility to open up through our own building, through an exhibition designed by us, accessibility to things that had not yet been seen, although maybe seemingly very normal for the rest or other parts of the world. So this meeting point all of a sudden became part of a further development of culture within this building. So going back to power and duty, the power is the architecture, the duty is to fulfill its program. The landscapes of the soul also came as a book. And of course, as we know, or it was the first Arabic and English-speaking book on Edvard Munch at all. So it has left to right reading and right to left reading, obviously. And all these things meet in the middle. But when we started looking at the social impact of the buildings that we're dealing with and how you actually create accessibility to something not existing to open up, let's say, or sensitize rather the public, we saw that we needed to move even further. And the next part of the next steps that we were doing was to do the manufacture for Swarovski in Wattens. We generated together with Swarovski and with the city of Wattens the idea that we would turn a factory production line, factory spaces, into cultural activities at the same time. So we created an almost invisible building sitting somewhere there with not very much exterior kind of expression, but with a very important function on the interior side, namely to create one big space that in itself would not only be the production line of crystals, where the workers on the floor would be part of a cultural space where clients, designers, users, the public, and the workers were mixing in one large space. And this has turned into an enormous success, I would say, because this type of factory thinking with the light, which of course then demands a different aspect from architecture. It demands that the architecture also takes the responsibility of not only being a factory, but a hybrid factory on board. And in developing the spaces and how they're laid out and where the production lines are, we are of a firm belief that a lot of production facilities could again be moved into the center of towns. Almost like an old way of dealing with how you live, work, and produce. Right now, most cities have their industrial zones outside of the city centers, but we believe quite strongly that you don't necessarily need to do that in the future. So all these production lines that we have here are, of course, part of this more or less cultural building that became Swarovski. If you move up to the gallery, we have a kind of slightly different ways of moving, exhibitions, testing, clothing, and it's all a factory, but it's also a workplace for offices, clients, users, and the public. And if you come down into the basement, obviously also all of these elements have been dealt with. So in this size and in this explanation of accessibility when it comes to social understanding, we have continued working quite a bit within certain terminologies of things that we believe are important. These nodes or these places, which we are calling keyless structures, they are open 24 hours to the public, translated into a small factory like the Swarovski factory, also found its way into more isolated locations of smaller cabins, smaller installations that would be open to a larger public 24 hours a day. Like here at the Tværfjellet, which is the small reindeer pavilion at Dovre with the view towards the mountain Snøhetta. An exterior view, you can see the mountain Snøhetta here in the background. Or this small cabin, which is for hikers to go in, get warm, stay overnight, find a little bit of food if they don't carry it with them, fireplace inside. And of course, how that has been handcrafted, and every piece of wood has been dealt with by the axe. So you're getting into all these kind of deep end understandings of smaller pieces of architecture, starting from the big into the small, back again up to the big pieces of architecture, testing, trying to emphasize certain things, especially during our first period, the 21st years, dealing with social sustainability. So when I was asked to participate in the discussion on power and duty, I named this little lecture The Best Weapon. And as you might know, the best weapon is to sit down and talk is a quote from Nelson Mandela. And in this terminology, there is the notion of power and duty that is dealing with the essence of the architecture that we're doing. What does it contribute physically for the possibility of sitting down and talking, sitting down and meeting, sitting down and exchanging? So we were asked to design a bench for the UN in New York, which is later to be exhibited outside the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo. But everything we do, even down to the smallest element of a welding or how you deal with the exposure of something, it ends up in physical shape at some point or another. And the content of what you're trying to expose needs also to be coherent with what you're saying, with what you want it to do and what you want it to achieve. So this bench sort of works with this curved shape through gravity, bringing people together in the middle of the bench, sitting and talking, whether it'll be a couple, friends, mothers and children, or the children themselves only, whether they be another couple finding out about the problems they are having, whether it'll be politicians, famous some of them, from the front or from the back. Holding these things together, in a sense, makes meaning worthwhile working for. And the simplest physical objects might have a way of explaining things that affects us in the way we behave and what we do, down to the smallest detail. And the smallest creatures, a design that we made is for the honeybee colonies, this kind of tiny little creature that is so important for the earth. And we've created these two, and now a series of them. Beehives for approximately 80,000 bees in each. They are actually quite high-tech inside, controlling temperature and moisture. With the openings, the recognition of the queen from the opening of the beehive, but more importantly, they produce 80 kilograms of honey each, bringing that honey down into the shop below. But we can go even smaller, and what we talk about is singular experience. If you look at the frequency of sound and time per second, you will understand that the patterns of sound also deeply reflect how we think. So the notion of aesthetics is not only related to what we see, of course, what we smell, but also, of course, what we hear, what we touch, and what we taste. And based on that, we developed a project for something called the Norwegian Soloist choir, which is basically a graphic design, but it's taking singular in the plural as something very important. It is defining the individual tone scale of each person and giving each person a graphic representation. And this graphic representation then is clearly related to one person in the choir, singling himself or herself out from the rest, but still being part of the family. And in this way of dealing with things, we can give people personalities beyond their face recognition. And they become part of the music that they're actually playing. They have names connected to these patterns. And of course, we can also utilize that in the transition of how music is being perceived. So the idea, the big picture here with the social aspect of these projects that we've been doing for so many years is to rely on individuality and collectivity. The singular contribution into the overall picture starts embodying our collective spirit. Whether it's walking on the roof of an opera house, whether it's opening up the communal entrance and accessibility to culture in Saudi Arabia, or if it's singling out in the collective base a choir of soloists. All these things are essential for us in order for us to continue experimentation with social sustainability. We believe that social sustainability is the mother of all sustainabilities, and unless the stability of a society, the political systems, the justness in how things are being distributed is in place, we will also struggle with environmental sustainability and climate issues and climate challenges for the future. But still, after a period of time at Snøhetta, when we merely focused on the social sustainability of things, we started about 12 years ago also to look at a very strong kind of direction when it comes to environmental issues. So of course, with the first projects that we were doing over the first 20 years, they all had a fairly clear relationship to how materials were being used and the limitation and almost reductionist approach to materials. If you choose a material, don't change that material until you absolutely have to. There is no necessity of changing a material every second meter just for the sake of aesthetics or, let's say, playfulness of architecture. So for these user phases, which we define as 60 years, we have always been looking at the use, the maintenance, the repair, replacement, and refurbishment of existing materials. But the big step after projects like the Opera House or other cabins around Norway in use of materials, we took the big step to start looking at a much wider aspect of environmental sustainability. We started looking at the production line of the building materials, the transport of them, what is happening on the site. We started looking at the user phase over 6 years, and we started looking at the deconstruction or demolition of the building in a CO2 perspective and in a CO2 equivalent. So we subdivided these in the powerhouse constellation together with Entra, who's a Norwegian property owner, Skanska as a contractor, Zero as an environmental lobbyist organization, Asplan Viek as engineers, and us as architects. This group started expanding on the possibilities that might happen when it comes to these issues. So we started looking at the raw material supply and CO2 equivalents, the transport equivalents, the manufacturing processes, and the type of energy that went into the manufacturing as such. Then we started to the construction site looking at the transport, the installation processes, and how much energy and CO2 equivalents were embedded. Of course, we continued with the use, maintenance, repair, replacement, and refurbishment into the phase, but like I said, also started looking at deconstruction. Now, typical projects in this period of powerhouses is Brattakaia, which of course produces significantly more energy, clean energy, than it uses, or prototype one-family houses, which are dealing with the same. But the one I wanted to go in depth with, to make clear to you that Snøhetta is not about style. Snøhetta is not about what the buildings actually look like, because we put in front of ourselves a certain task that we have to solve, and sometimes that demands a certain contextual expression in one direction, and maybe 3 months down the road, you have another project which demands a completely different aspect when it comes to contextual understanding. So just outside of Oslo, we were to refurbish an existing office building out of the 70s, and to try to give it new life without tearing it down. So now we're into reconstruction of existing office buildings. The plan layout was extremely simple. There were 2 squares basically connected, slightly different in level. And we opened up the space first, took it down to its primary constructive elements, sorted out all the existing building materials that had been used on the building, sorted them nicely for reuse in the building later. And we made one open plan office space and one cell office relationship with a core that has a very important meaning. And I'll get back to that later. So all of these things that we created had a very significant kind of approach. The first one was the skin and the insulation of the building, to create a completely new skin, but with exactly the same looks that you had in the 70s. But we burnt the wood, so you would actually get this deep end understanding of how the wood would protect itself for a lifespan of approximately 120 years. The next one was the energy production line with the photovoltaic cells, delivering clean energy to the building. And the third one, very interestingly, was how ventilation system was going to work in the building, natural ventilation system. We actually used the stairs as a ventilation shaft. So this stair is taking the draft of all the air coming in and out of the building into the building, and actually distributing it through the stair shaft to the exterior. And these cores became important because this is also where you distribute cold air and warm air into the different office spaces. Through these walls, you can see down to the right how that opens up for natural ventilation and low-speed air circulation, which of course also has a big issue in relationship to the interior climate. Not only the dryness or the ionization of the air, but simply a dust gathering situations in different places of this building. So everything inside here is reused plastic, reused glass, reused ceilings that came from the other building from before. And in addition, of course, heat exchanging systems that could not be seen. So this particular building was the first time that we understood that, yes, it is possible within the calculation all the way down to demolition in the lifespan of a building to actually get CO2 neutral within the total amount of things that you're spending for this building. Consumption, construction, reconstruction, reuse. And that was one of the really big moments, I think, for us. Not only related to the architecture and the expression of the architecture, but that we actually found within the existing systems of this world the possibility of creating this type of building. Now, right now, we're expanding on the powerhouse notion and going one step further at the end of life cycle. For the powerhouses that we have created so far, we've only reached the deconstruction and demolition phase. Now we're looking at the transportation of life cycle analysis. That means the transportation of all the materials that you're taking away from a building. We're looking at the overall waste processing of materials that might not go into a recycling process. And we're looking at the disposal of these things. Examples of this is Torg in Oslo, which we're starting to construct this year, which is, of course, a 0-0 building, a 0-0 building, no heating, no cooling, and energy production and wood. Interestingly enough, we've managed here also to plant 3 new trees for every cubic meter of wood that we're actually using, which is what it needs to be CO2 neutral as a minimum. Ventilation systems bringing in. But another example could be this little renovation for Harvard, which is a sort of interesting approach to an existing type of architecture that needed an expansion. So it was all about, again, how the building sits on the site, how it exposes itself to its surroundings, how energy consumption is being perceived, and how these different spaces feel when it comes to comfort, daylight situations, and office comfort. So this is also a 0-0 building. No cooling, no heating, energy production also through hot air chimney, bringing everything back. And this also gives us the understanding of every piece of building material gone into the building has a dedicated long-term lifespan for either reuse, relocation, or recycling. But we have also tried to go all the way and to reuse, recover, and recycle everything. But unfortunately, this logistic enormous task has not yet given us the possibility of getting there. There are too many conflicts in the building industry to actually be able to go there full way. So the only one we have managed to do so with so far is a plastic chair, which is called the S1500, which is developed based on ocean plastic waste and from fish farming industries. And it has an EPD, environmental product declaration in Norway, so you can follow every part of it down to the smallest portion, even down to the small knobs that actually separates the recycled steel parts of the chair to the ground. But the other, maybe interestingly enough, could be the Swat Hotel, which is soon coming up, which is a very strong kind of understanding of and relating to different issues, not only the issues of tourism and the load of tourism into certain areas, but maybe more the reduction of tourism by creating pieces of architecture which allow you to kind of separate how you get to these points. So Swat is one of these things where we've started looking at, as with the chair, a full EPD of the building per se. You could see that if you look at Swat in comparison with what is the Norwegian Tech 15 model and the consumption of energy, which would for a hotel this size be approximately 3.6 million kilowatt hours per year. Already in the consumption, in the everyday consumption that we have with this hotel, we've already gone down to 484,000 kilowatt hours per year, which is a dramatic drop. And this brings me maybe to one important point. When we've managed to reduce the consumption of energy down to a minimum, where do we go from there? When we actually do produce much more energy than we consume, how are we going to start getting environmentally sound buildings up there, if not looking at the materials and the CO2 footprint of the materials? So if you look here, operations in this Swat Hotel only is 13% of the overall CO2 footprint of the building. The photovoltaic itself is 17% of the total picture of CO2 footprint. And the deck structure is 22. So you see the operations is at the minimum of where it can go. So if you push and leave operations where it is and say that is the minimum of consumption we can actually live with to have a halfway decent interior climate, then you need to push all the rest of the CO2 footprints together and reduce this footprint. And we know that a lot of materials are getting rare. So the choice of material is getting essential for environmental thinking in the future. Let me just give one example of this might be Swat, the energy balance through the lifespan of say 60 years of a building like this. So at the very beginning here, you will see the curve falling deeply down to minus 25,000 kilowatt hours at primer energy. So that is basically your starting point after the construction is finished. And slowly, through clean energy production, you have to pay your way back up to a break-even point around zero. Before you have produced enough clean energy to get up there, it's taken you approximately 60 years. Even by producing a lot more energy than you're actually consuming. So what if the starting point of a new construction would be less than minus 15,000 kilowatt hours primer energy? The starting point of the embedded CO2 would be much less. You can see that we would have a breaking point with zero already 20 years earlier. And now comes a surprise. If the electricity mix in Europe did not demand photovoltaic cells for energy production, we would reduce it almost 30 years. Because the photovoltaics themselves are so CO2 intensive, even though they're producing clean energy. But simply by getting rid of them, we would be also in a much better place. So we have to look at our communal delivery of clean energy worldwide. To end this little thing that I'm dealing with now, I just wanted to show you a little project called Under, because it's dealing with the possible future of economic sustainabilities in hybrid situations. Under is a small restaurant, but as you might not know, it's also a biological research institution. So combination of economies in the future is going to be paying off the best things that we're looking for when it comes to what architecture and design can do. So this little concrete building was built on a raft. It was floated to its site. It was filled with water and sunken into the water and just fixed with the bolts into the bottom of the water, bottom of the sea. But, you know, all of these things in section, in plan, trying to allow for a different type of hybrid building started becoming clear to us when we saw the way we needed to make money and support for something that was both a public and a research institution. So coming over the bridge towards this building, maybe sitting down on one of our designed benches, seeing the blue open at the end to the underwater world, further down, dropping in by the bar and having a champagne maybe, looking at the level of the water through a vertical window which shows exactly the edge of the water, and then finally getting down, looking for your seat, sitting down on the chair, also designed by us. And as you can see, the line of the chair goes from over to under, to over to under. So everything is connected to everything, as Gro Harlem Brundtland said. And as you sit down, look back to the others. Before you start eating, you know the chef has been out there getting the food for you, connected it to the architecture, put it in place. You're enjoying, you're looking at the things that come out of the ocean, and all of a sudden you've had a meal. But during this meal, you have been part of a biological research program. And simply, while you've been sitting there, most likely new species have been discovered. Only during the first year, we discovered 4 new jellyfish species outside the coasts of Norway. We've been able to count the number of lobster larvae in the water per cubic meter. And the reason is that this is not a diver. This is not a way of trying to move through the waters. This is a stable platform for observation. And this stable, continuous platform for observation does almost not exist along the waters of Norway. And the information we're getting out of there is extremely, extremely important. As you leave this little restaurant, you know that you've also been part of a research program. Now, at the very, very end, just let me say, the things that we pull, the knowledge that we pull out of these projects that we're dealing with, the post-occupancy studies, the way we can see the effect of the buildings and the relevance of them, looking at all kinds of comparisons after the buildings have been finished, after the first 5, 10, 15 years, gives us information to understand, is it a contribution? Has it changed behavior? Are we living in cognitive situations? Does it contribute by building, or does it dilute by building? Does it give us the understanding of what we need to do in the future? And can it give us important information to see how the economies of this whole thing is belonging together, to end up with what we call embedded collective intuition for us to do even better work, more relevant work in the future. So this was my little contribution to Power and Duty, collective intuition. Maybe, Matthias, there are certain things here we can hang on to discuss. So over to you.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for this extraordinarily generous lecture, which is really spanning such a huge range of subjects and topics, and giving a very good insight in the scope of projects and activities that you and your office are involved in. I can really congratulate you only on the sheer prolific kind of portfolio that you are presenting. But there are, of course, a lot of questions which I'd be very curious to pose to you. I mean, let's maybe start off with this issue of form, because you've been touching on it several times. Peter Smithson once said, I think, architecture is not about form, right? And I presume, and I saw that, by the way, you were working with Ralph Erskine at some point. So, I mean, this is like, we're approximately the same age. Actually, I'm just a little older than you, but this is like the youth, the beginning of our careers. I mean, the kind of Team 10 mentalities and so on and so forth. And obviously, we've been going through postmodernism and this new kind of emergence of parametric design, etc., etc. So, I mean, if I look at the first project that you showed, the Cultural Center in Saudi Arabia, I'm sort of wondering, you were talking about at the very beginning about affect, behavior, and cognition, and somewhere in between, you were also saying that form has a meaning, and you were explaining actually how you were trying to via kind of symbolic sculptural language, you were trying to communicate to an audience and maybe even a kind of government or kind of authorities in Saudi Arabia, how the kind of smallest part is important. That, of course, I mean, smallest, the keystone holding the kind of construction of maybe society as a whole. That is obviously something that may not even be understood in our cultural context. And I don't know much about Saudi Arabia, to be honest, but I would suspect that it's also not necessarily obvious to the average Saudi Arabian who kind of passes by. So this kind of question of architecture parlante, if you want to call it that. I mean, as an architecture that carries through its form a symbolic meaning, or wants to in any case. How? I mean, do you have precedent? I mean, can you name kind of favorite pieces of architecture that were sort of acting in a similar way, or is that something that is kind of really generated out of the particular practice you're involved in?
I mean, on one hand, if we talk about our projects, but you know, of course, the Guggenheim in New York is a typical example. If something sets the standard for the first time, I think it is quite essential that it goes beyond the borderlines of accepting what it is from a traditional point of view. I think it needs to break boundaries. So it's not like I'm ignorant to form, but I just think form has to have one way of being explained. Now, whether you go into that explanation at a later stage when the project is already there is a different issue. It might just be a subdued kind of information happening through the project. And hopefully, as I said also earlier in the lecture, this is all about sensitizing the public. Maybe, to some extent, not necessarily understanding why they are feeling the way they are, or why they are reacting the way they are, but they are subdued into something that on one hand is very close to them, on the other hand may be distant. So form does matter. I'm not ignorant to form, but form in relationship to some of the things we're testing, when each of the projects that we're dealing with, as they have been, are examples of possible futures, it is important to me not to overemphasize this issue. But of course, in Saudi Arabia, where there hadn't been a cultural building before, right? You need to set an example. You need to be extremely precise. You need to make sure that people are talking about this building. Otherwise, they will also not talk about the culture.
I totally agree. I mean, in terms of, you were saying effect, I mean, in terms of effect, I'm sure that this building has an enormous impact. I mean, the original photographs were really, truly impressive. Without wanting to be kind of probing, but on an architectural level, I mean, if you name the Guggenheim, you could claim with the Guggenheim that it's a form that was generated through use. I mean, through the kind of notion of viewing art in this kind of spiral route, the choreography, if you like, of an exhibition space, which is very, very deliberate, and the inverted kind of cone, if you like, could be read as a more or less direct result of that idea of choreography. And similarly, I would dare to say that in the second half of your lecture, you were showing us examples of form making or form generation of form that was almost scientific. I mean, like, for example, the beautiful, is it a corporate image or something? I don't know. I mean, it's a representation of the musical team, the kind of choir, and its its collective identity and its individuality within that, and so on. That I thought totally plausible. And also, of course, the kind of scientific approach in terms of, say, the Harvard project or other powerhouse projects, where every kind of move has very much kind of measurable impact on an overall kind of performance, life cycle performance or whatever. I mean, you're familiar with the term, I think coined by Hugo Hering, called Leistungsform, right? For him, a hammer, for example, was a form that was generated through its activity or its needs, its performance, its function. And obviously functionalists were looking for forms that would perform in a similar way. Now, I detect a tendency towards Leistungsform in the work that you were talking about in terms of sustainability, but I also see a kind of rather opulent sculptural work at the very beginning, as you say, and I mean, not that I'm being critical about it, I'm just trying to understand, you know, how do you get there, and how do you, in terms of a context and so on and so forth. I mean, are you aiming to create astonishment, create kind of almost like confrontation in order to bring this new institution to the attention of the viewers, or what exactly is the thinking, and also maybe the process, how you get there?
Right. Maybe some architects, maybe that includes us, we should look upon ourselves as great studio musicians. You know, you can because you know the instruments that you're playing, you can play any type of music. And some of the best musicians I know in this world are studio musicians, being able to jump from one type of music to another. There is this enormous understanding of the deep end of music, which is like urmusik, that is embedded in this, and that is independent of how much you thrive, how sculptural or how little sculptural you are at the other end. It's all depending on how you develop the concept for that particular piece of architecture at hand and in the context. I mean, we've gone to the point where we start sort of looking at ourselves as conceptual contextualists almost, which is a contradiction in a way. I mean, of course, there is a certain element of schizophrenia in this also, but apart from that, why shouldn't it be possible, and I'm asking this question, to go in and really deep and understand the generic aspects of architecture at a certain level, which is different from what it looks like, which is deeply embedded in human activity, which is deeply embedded in meeting points between people. And then you can react based on style more freely as and how you actually provide type of spaces, architectural typologies to the people that actually go there. I would claim that the new cultural house with the concerts and libraries and everything in Saudi Arabia needed to express itself differently than the opera house in Oslo, which again needed to express itself differently to the Under restaurant. They are contextual in the sense that they embody type of generic elements which are dealing with human activities and closeness to these human activities. And that, you know, you can fall in love in an empty swimming pool. It's not physically intended for you to do so, but if there is no water and you meet the right girl inside this empty swimming pool, there is no reason why you shouldn't fall in love. So what I'm saying is the independence of certain shapes and forms and the tool that it actually provides is more the argumentation for why you're creating this stage, why you're creating this tool. So for instance, for us to be able to argue that we have an entrance for men and women together into the cultural center, it needed to have a shape that was unarguably one entrance. There had to be an aesthetic perception of it, not being able to have a side entrance in either direction. So the form language becomes a way of arguing certain intentions that you have with the design. And to me, that is maybe where we could possibly go in the future, is to investigate some of these elements more deeply, to understand that what we're getting involved in is not design, but it is designed for capturing, like I said, society's more sensitive sides.
Out of interest, who was your client partner in the Saudi Arabian job? I mean, who was that? Kind of a nascent cultural institution with a sort of intendant, kind of director, or was it a kind of government authority or ministry or something? I mean, who were you dealing with?
It was the Saudi Aramco, which is the world's biggest company. Oil company.
Oh, so it's the oil company basically. It's in a way it's a kind of what in Germany.
And they have a separate cultural division. And their former director which started this project, was a great admirer of culture, of books, of opera, of music, and collections. He could actually recite the Norwegian author Ibsen more than I could.
Oh, really? Amazing.
Yeah, so we were having this kind of cultural meeting point, and his vision.
And is it located in a town, or is it outside, or where? How do you get there? Is there some transport system or something, or?
Yeah, there is a bus system, but mainly this building is now for all school classes from 1 to 6 throughout the whole region of East Saudi Arabia and the Eastern province. So every school class from 1 to 6th grade are now coming to see and visit this, and mainly they come in buses together. And it's amazing to see what kind of production lines in culture, how many more new writers, filmmakers, has come out of only 2.5 years of operating this building. And that, of course, again, is changing the attitude towards culture and cultural expression. So then you can always debate, you know, the change of Saudi, is that sort of an argument in direction of trying to falsify or beautify a picture. But for these people that I've met, it's actually a reality. And they are getting interested in music.
And isn't there kind of, I mean, again, I mean, I have to admit a kind of blissful ignorance as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, but I mean, isn't there a kind of quite a strong religious regime in a way that would be probably quite opposed to what you were actually saying about, you know, both genders coming together in these spaces and so on and so forth, rather sort of Western sort of understanding of public space, if you like?
Yep. And in a way you could say that when you're being challenged with these type of things, it's always controversial. I got hate mails in Oslo from certain regions of people when they understood you could actually walk on the roof of the opera.
Oh, really?
How can you step on the opera house?
Not to speak about bicycle on it, no?
Yeah, or drive a motorbike on it. You know, we will always, large or small, governmental or non-governmental, we're not expecting to serve everyone at an equal level here. But in the end, it's about that little girl who drives, who's operating the green bicycle, and it's about the filmmaker who actually makes that film, and that film becomes internationally popular, but even more popular in Saudi.
Out of interest, I mean, obviously the building, it's not just a monument to education and the kind of freedom that comes with education. It's also must be read as a kind of encouragement of just, you know, possibility. I mean, it's just like you sometimes come out of a museum and you think, wow, you know, the pieces that I've seen, I didn't know one could do things like that. And you kind of feel empowered. You feel like, wow, inspired to follow suit and do something similar, whatever. Similarly, I think your building must be inspiring young people. I mean, also in terms of architecture, I mean, amazing spaces that there are and constructions and so on. I mean, how did you manage the whole construction? Because it's quite sophisticated steelwork as far as I could see, and the cladding system is a little masterpiece. I mean, I don't assume that you were using local kind of craftspeople. I mean, how did you deal with that?
It was the whole construction is a mix between Saudi contractors and international contractors. But for the facade, especially, it was Sele, who actually had a production facility in Czechia, bending all the pipes, and the mounting team on site. But it was a huge, long-term coordination thing, and not simple. You know, I mean, working conditions on site like these, you have to force forward continuously, like we also did in Alexandria. You have to make sure that the workers on site are okay. You have to make sure they get paid regularly. You have to use your power as an architect in order for these things to go in the right direction. And you don't always succeed, but you have to keep trying, you have to keep pushing. So it was complex. It's structurally complex, it's mechanically complex, electrically complex. The steel structures are extremely complex, together with Bureau Happold as engineers. But you know, the most relevant thing for me was that in this complexity, you learn about the capacities and the borderlines of a specific society to deliver. And even in a Saudi Aramco system, where there is a high technological element in what they do in the oil business, they had never ever been through any object as complex as this one. And I'm not sure I would do one again either.
That's a good thing, that you don't know what's coming when you start something like that. Otherwise, you might not want to do it again. Yeah. I think it's a really fascinating example, and I think it's quite admirable the way you speak about it so openly. To kind of pick up on another subject, I mean, we've just been organizing this exhibition together here at the Akademie called Urbanable Stadthaltung, where you were presenting a kind of a plan for the extension of the city of Budapest in an area that's characterized by an old arm of the Danube. So it's largely preoccupied with water, the management of water, and also the kind of let's say urban tradition of water. And at the same time, you had also in the last year, I think, you had an exhibition in AIDES, where you were showing interesting AIDES, the architecture gallery here in Berlin. You were showing projects that were to do with landscape, really. And you were writing in it as well about the periphery as the new center, which, of course, in the context of the debate that you were referring to earlier, i.e. sustainability or architectural sustainability, not just related to energy consumption in the operation of buildings, but the whole production process, the whole life cycle, anything to do with the building, such as the mobility around it, for example. This is a key question. And the hypothesis of the exhibition, in a way, was that we were saying sustainable development really has to happen in cities, because we have to make use of the density of the infrastructure, of the sort of existing grey energy that is there. And of course, this was also pre-pandemic, one has to say. We were also banking on the kind of power, the urban power of proximity of people together, and kind of creating communities, exchanging foreseen and non-foreseen social exchanges, etc., etc. So, I mean, my question to you a little bit is, obviously, Norway has a huge expanse of land. It's not a country that's as dense as Germany, for example, but nevertheless, there's certain urban traditions. And how do you see those urban traditions changing? I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe Budapest is a good example to explain that a little bit.
Yeah, maybe it was, to go all the way and saying the periphery is the new center is maybe taking it a little far. But let me explain a little bit what I see when it comes to defining decentralized centralization structures. That could even be within smaller portions of a city, neighborhoods, blocks, understanding of densification in certain situations which are not necessarily the center. So the periphery of a city might become the new center. It might become the new center in itself. So this particular quote that you took does not necessarily redefine or sort of a countryside and city as a contrast. It looks at the borderlines between what is normally understood as a center and what is normally understood as a periphery. And where are these solutions? Where are the solutions? So let's say the periphery and expansion of a city does not have the capacity or enabling itself to become a new center in its density, referring to Budapest, if that doesn't create its own value as a new center for inhabitants, for users of this area, then also the periphery of the city is losing its impact versus the old center. So I was more interested in this compactness of decentralized centralization structures, where the density of something that per definition goes in and is central is in correlation to density. But that density might not have to be in already existing definitions of density inside a city. It could be surrounding the periphery of the city, or it could be densifying ensembles of buildings in relationships to locations around different places of the world. So once you start building somewhere, continue building in that specific place. Don't widespread it into singulars. And this has been a big issue when it comes to moving into situations with natural resources, but it's also been a big issue when it comes to understanding remoteness and experiencing uniqueness. So if everyone wants a piece of land around himself, which is as big as, downtown Manhattan, which is a castle basically, then all of a sudden we're losing on the distribution of public space. So the notion of the periphery being the new center is that everything that is being created, so to speak, even in the periphery, has to have the capacity of becoming a center of something.
And do you think, has your view on that changed, in the last year, or is it too early to talk about post-pandemic kind of situations?
No, it hasn't changed. I think density is still the solution to environmental issues. And we have to relate to how we densify it. But we should probably look at smaller centralization elements which are decentralized for better control, internal control. And that doesn't mean public control or political control. So I think density, yes, we need it. We need to be close to someone. That's why we move into urban situations. That's why I live in the city of Oslo and not at my home island, Karmøy, because I would be far too far off everything, although it's beautiful. But beauty is not enough. And in these situations, the capacity of generating a certain centralized density in the future is going to be as necessary as it was before the pandemics. But maybe the block of neighborhoods, the barrio thinking, needs to be reintroduced when it comes to what is at the center of my life and how big is my surrounding when it comes to the central understanding. And this proportionate division of areas we also tried to do in Budapest by creating sort of smaller units of urban developments which sort of became their own neighborhoods.
I mean, as you're speaking, I associate the kind of image of that was generated by Bruno Taut in the kind of 100 years ago approximately, von der Auflösung der Städte, the kind of dissolution of cities, where he was imagining sort of like flower-like pods of communities, just as you're describing it. Of course, we have situations that could be described as comparable in Germany, where huge agglomerations spread out, and yes, we do have kind of former villages that form kind of centers, but there's also a lot of undefined territory in between, and obviously one would have to find ways of kind of really redefining the kind of community or the kind of the village, if you like, or the small town or whatever, the garden town maybe, as opposed to untouched land. And I guess you're also describing in your catalog how national parks in Norway are being created in order to protect land, in order to sort of somehow divide the land in such a way that it remains accessible, but nature can still develop more or less in a protected way. Yeah. Let me just,
I'm not against regulations. you know, if they do the right thing.
Right. We are kind of way longer than we wanted to be, but it's been fantastically interesting. And let me just ask one final question, which is about technology, because you are quite obviously using computer technology, both in terms of your designing, but also in terms of production, and be it your kind of your product design kind of arm up to the facade design that you were showing in Saudi Arabia. I mean, where do you see? I mean, what's the philosophy in the office there? I mean, do you see this kind of as a kind of straightforward route forward? Is it going to affect the way we're working? And can you somehow include it in the way you're thinking and the way your kind of design processes work, or do you see a big change?
I mean, approximately 15 years ago, we started looking at the prepositions contained within, on one hand, the digital, and on the other hand, the analog. And we subdivided the kind of back and forth process between the analog and the digital into 4 phases. We started off with the analog element, which is what you do with your hands only, like say clay. You work with clay, it's completely analog, and you have an object and it's shaped by your hands only. So that's totally analog. Then we have what we called analog digital. And analog digital means you shape something with your hands and then you scan it to vectorize it and bring it into the computer. So you've created something analog, but you vectorize it to become digital. Then you have digital analog, which is things created within a software program that then is being produced by a robot, say, and becomes analog as a product at the other end. Like the wooden interior of this reindeer pavilion, which is produced by CNC machines precisely informed about the shapes that we wanted this wooden element to have. And then at the other end, you have the digital, which is the information that stays on the screen only. It never comes out to become any kind of touchable element. And what we do, and that is the discussion right now after in the post-pandemic period, hopefully soon, is how are you weighing these different portions of things that you're doing in any case? Because for many years, we've been shifting between one and the other, back and forth in processes. We see now a slight shift in direction of digital analog and digital proportionate in relationship to the analog. But we want to maintain steady course and go back to our workshops and make sure that the things we do with our hands is still a major portion of that. So temporarily, we're shifting into a more digital thing, but I'm hoping to move it back into as strong analog as it was before the pandemic.
Yeah, that's our hope, that we will come back to somehow something that resembles the normal that we used to know a year ago. Thank you very much, Kjetil, for this highly inspiring and informative conversation and talk. I hope to be able to continue our conversation in person at some point in the year. We will have our next meeting in June. Maybe there will already be a possibility to get together again in Berlin. If not, then it's going to be September or October, as a matter of fact. Thank you very much, and all the best to Oslo, and à bientôt.
Enjoyable.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you, ciao.